General business, general notices of motion. General notice 2826, standing in the name of the member for Sydney.
I call the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. I move that this House 1 commends all members of the New Democracy Citizens Jury entitled City of Sydney Safe and Vibrant Nightlife in relation to alcohol-fuelled violence. 2, acknowledges that the Citizens Jury process had the support of the Thomas Kelly Youth Foundation, Lord Mayor of Sydney and Premier of New South Wales. 3, notes the recommendations of the jury relating to diversity, transport, policing and safety, education and media, lockouts and licensing. And 4, requests the government to consider the recommendations of the jury. Through New Democracy and with the support of the Thomas Kelly Youth Foundation, Lord Mayor of Sydney and former Premier O'Farrell, last year 43 citizens were randomly selected to look at how we can prevent late night violence. In April, the Citizens Jury for a Vibrant and Safe Sydney delivered 25 unanimous recommendations covering diversity, transport, policing and safety, education, media and lockouts and licensing. I hope the government will seriously consider these recommendations as they are sensible. Jury members had no political agenda and worked hard on finding innovative solutions. They visited hotspots late on a Saturday night and early into the next morning. They met with staff at St Vincent's Hospital and spoke to police, City of Sydney staff and experts, and indeed took submissions. Recommendations were made to both the City of Sydney Council and the state government, and some would also require Commonwealth government implementation. The jury acknowledged that people want to go out at night and want that experience to be safe. The jury recognised the need to diversify the late night economy. It recommended providing people with more entertainment options late at night that don't just focus on binge drinking, such as shopping, food, music, libraries and art shows. This is in line with what people tell me. Many want choices tailored to different age groups and more civilised and cultured taste. It follows the popularity of initiatives like the Australian Museum's Jurassic Lounge Nights and the City of Sydney's late night library events of storytelling, debates, live music and film screenings. The jury highlighted that people want more late night transport options and that they want to be able to get home quicker and easier. They found that while there were some transport options to specific drop-off points, there wasn't necessarily transport to get them home after this, and the jury made solving this problem a focus of its recommendations. The jury recommended running the entire Sydney Metropolitan bus network between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. on Friday and Saturday nights, which they say would be funded through risk-based licensing fees, such as the fees that the government has now introduced. It has recommended further research on patronage in support of running train services late at night and early mornings on the weekend. The jury argues that we need to remove barriers to and encourage private shuttle services as a new option to get people home. These proposals are sensible and should be implemented. The jury supports increased visibility of police, and I understand more police have been present in late-night inner-city hotspots to coincide with the recent introduction of the new liquor venue trading restrictions, and that this has contributed to a welcome drop in assaults. There are also recommendations for the City of Sydney to increase CCTV coverage, which is important in reducing crime, however requires local community support because many live in the inner city and have legitimate concerns about invasion of their privacy in their homes. I understand that the City of Sydney is installing 10 additional cameras. There is a strong focus on education about binge drinking and violence, particularly for young people, and the jury recommends community awareness campaigns promoted through licensed venues, takeaway outlets, social media and sporting events. It supports reducing advertising of alcoholic products before 10 p.m. The jury's recommendations on lockouts and licensing aim to prevent violence while retaining an exciting and diverse night scene. The jury recommends risk-based licensing, which, as I've stated already, the government has already introduced. It recommends increasing the Office of Liquor, Gaming and Racing inspections to enforce responsible service of alcohol provisions in high-risk licence premises on Friday and Saturday nights, which is essential. Serving alcohol to intoxicated patrons increases the likelihood of alcohol-related harm. While it is an offence to serve alcohol to someone who is intoxicated, a walk down Darlinghurst Road on a Saturday or Sunday morning before sunrise proves that this happens frequently, and monitoring and enforcement must be increased. Earlier this year, the government introduced 1:30 a.m. lockouts and a 3 a.m. cessation of service of alcohol in venues in the King's Cross area, Sydney CBD entertainment precincts. The government said it will review these provisions in 2 years. At the time, I argued that this was too long and requested an independent review within 6 months. The Citizens' Jury recommends a review in 12 months, which I feel is much better than 2 years. We need an earlier review because young people report that live entertainment, arts and culture are suffering, and they feel alienated by the process that they say imposed arbitrary restrictions on their entertainment. Some licensees say their takings have reduced between 40 to 70% and that staff have already been laid off. It is important because while there is good international evidence that earlier cessation of alcohol service reduces violence, there is limited evidence in support of lockouts, and the lockouts are reported to be having the biggest impact on the vibrancy of Sydney's late night scene. There are also anecdotal reports that Newtown at night is starting to look a lot like King's Cross, and I understand that the Star Casino has had a massive increase in patrons attempting to enter on the second weekend of the lockouts, and of course it concerns me greatly the link between people drinking and gambling, and indeed that these conditions are leading more people to go into an entertainment venue focused on gambling. My constituents in areas adjacent to precincts remain concerned about growth in late night entertainment in their neighbourhood. These issues should be assessed soon. The jury supported exemptions from the latest trading restrictions for venues with a proven record of good behaviour, no incidents and lower risk to public safety. Live music venues and LGBTI venues have been calling for this, and they say that they are part of the solution against late night violence because they provide their patrons with a safe place to watch entertainment. The Bingham Cup will be held in Sydney in August. It is one of the world's largest LGBTI sporting events and is expected to make a massive economic contribution to Sydney and New South Wales. Thousands of interstate and international visitors will be in Sydney for the event to celebrate at LGBTI late night venues. I urge the government to consider sensible exemptions for this important LGBTI event that are for venues that are considered low risk, provide live entertainment and are ACON safe spaces. Exemptions could be made for the 1:30am lockout, leaving in place the 3am cessation of service. Former Premier O'Farrell promised to table a Citizens' Jury report, and I hope the new Premier will give it the consideration it deserves. I commend the motion to the House.
The question is the motion from the member for Sydney be agreed to. I call the member for Coogee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm pleased to speak to this motion from the member for Sydney. The Citizens' Jury was an initiative of the City of Sydney with input and support from the New South Wales Government, which formed to consider the issue of alcohol-related violence in our city. The 43 members of the jury met between 1st of February and the 5th of April this year and received presentations from stakeholders across government and the community. They've now presented a report containing some 25 recommendations to both the City of Sydney and the New South Wales Government. Now, the recommendations are presented in themes, and I'm particularly interested in the themes of lockouts and licensing and policing and safety, because a number of the jury's recommendations touch on areas which are very relevant to my electorate. So, my electorate of Coogee. So whilst the government has not yet finalised its position on many of the recommendations, I note their endorsement, the government's endorsement of the introduction of risk-based licensing fees in New South Wales. This work's already underway and it'll be known as the risk-based licensing fee scheme. Implementation is underway, and the regulations prescribing the detail of the scheme were approved by the Lieutenant Governor on the 14th of May 2014. I'm also pleased to note that the Citizens' Jury has recommended that exemptions be made available from some regulatory restrictions, for example, where a venue can demonstrate good behaviour and a reduction in their risk levels. Exemptions from some of the provisions of the government's tough new liquor laws can be sought through Olga. There's an application form for businesses on the Olga website, although it must be said that obtaining an exemption will not be easy. Olga will assess each application on its merits before recommending whether the Secretary of the Department of Trade and Investment approves or declines the application. Another recommendation is that Olga increase its number of inspectors. Now, I'm advised that an assessment of the resources in Olga's compliance function is currently underway, and I expect will be provided with further advice once this work is complete. Finally, the jury also recommended that revenue generated from risk-based licence fee scheme be utilised to fund the implementation of its other recommendations particularly improve the late-night public transport. The revenue generated from the scheme will, in the first instance, be used to fund Olga's regulatory effort, including maintaining its increased compliance and enforcement presence, targeting high-risk venues and precincts. Should there be surplus revenue over and above this, the government will consider the most appropriate purposes to which it should be applied. Now, this government is serious about dealing with the issue of alcohol-related violence, more serious than any government has ever been in the history of this state. So I want to commend the Citizens Jury members for the work they've undertaken and thank them for their genuine interest in improving this city's vibrancy and, of course, the city's nightlife. Now, as the member for Coogee, but particularly when I was the Mayor of Randwick, when I first became a councillor on Randwick, the Coogee precinct was out of control when it came to alcohol, antisocial behaviour and violence. There were two of Sydney's largest pubs within 100 metres or so of one another, and at 3 a.m. it was described as the charge of the wildebeest, as one venue shut and the thousands of people moved across the Grant Reserve to head into the Coogee Bay Hotel. Now, of course, most of them are intoxicated, and the Coogee Bay Hotel does have a particularly strong security force there, and they were turned away. Those that were heavily intoxicated were not allowed into the Coogee Bay. So right on 3 a.m, when taxi changeover time was, Coogee was awash with drunks who couldn't get home, who were fighting over, getting into fights over their yeah, well, it's when I used to head down. Don't record it. And then, yes, I note that interjection from for Murray Darling, my darling Murray. Now, as I was saying, so people were getting into fights in queues to get their next kebab, and it was quite a disaster. Indeed, and so I called for, when I became mayor in 2008, I called for lockouts to be introduced in Coogee, 1:30 a.m. lockouts to be introduced at two of these pubs. Several months later, legislation was passed in this place to enable lockouts to be enforced, and lockouts were indeed placed on those premises in Coogee. Now, that was one of a number of approaches that we took to dealing with the issue of alcohol-related antisocial behaviour and violence in Coogee, but it had a significant effect on toning down the feel in that area, and it is now it's not without its problems, but compared to 2001, when 2002, etc., when it was at its height, it is now actually relatively very calm. There's no one silver bullet to deal with alcohol-related violence or antisocial behaviour. I note that it is having an impact on the patron numbers in the King's Cross, Oxford Street, Darlinghurst area, particularly on those gay and lesbian venues, and I've been in talks with representatives from that community to see that how we can try to ease the pain which those venues feel. But we do need in this state a change in the approach, our approach to alcohol, and anyway, I look forward to further contributing to this.
The question is that the motion from the member from Sydney be agreed to. I call the member for Lake Macquarie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I rise to support the member for Sydney with his motion here today, and I wish to commend the Sydney Citizens Jury, those people who participated in this fantastic initiative to deal with such a vexing problem within our society. I acknowledge the Lord Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore, and the former Premier Farrell for assisting to initiate or allowing this to go ahead in this way. Mr Speaker, this forum reported with its recommendations last month, and the jury's period of inquiry and discussion overlapped with growing community debate about safety in late-night entertainment precincts in the wake of a spate of alcohol and drug-fuelled predatory attacks on young men in Kings Cross in the inner city. Mr Speaker, as we know, the government moves swiftly to introduce new legislation to address these concerns, including provisions such as new offences and mandatory minimum sentences for alcohol fuel assaults, lockouts and curfews for nightclubs and other late-night entertainment venues, restrictions on the sale of shots, reduced operating hours for bottle shops and free late-night buses to ferry patrons out of the entertainment precinct. Can I say again, I absolutely condemn the government's move to introduce mandatory minimum sentencing. That is, I think, is a major move and something that should not have been done in this way, a very capricious way, without the engagement of the community on this. However, that doesn't mean that they didn't do very good things and very sensible things in other areas. And I believe the other moves to change the drinking culture that was introduced by the government and championed by the Premier at the time were very sensible, including the changes to the reducing the flow of alcohol into these areas after certain times of 1:30 lockouts and 3 o'clock cessation of alcohol. I note that the member for Sydney and others were concerned at the time about the impact that this might have on the night economy, but regardless, the government had to act. We needed a circuit breaker in here, and I think that the review that has been discussed here will allow now a considerable period of time to be looked at to see what can be done. Some of the suggestions in the report compiled by the Citizens Jury correspond with actions the government has taken to reduce alcohol fuel violence, but the Citizens Jury also makes good recommendations that go beyond these measures. These include initiatives to increase and broaden the nature of nighttime activities to a wider cross-section of people in the city, improvements to lighting and public toilets to enhance safety and amenity for people in the city at night, financial incentives to promote innovation and diversity in the nighttime economy, a reduction in regulatory requirements or red tape to streamline the process of approvals for events and festivals. The jury also made extensive recommendations in regard to improving transport options in and out of the city and increasing police presence and visibility. It endorsed government plans to engage in public awareness campaigns about dangers of binge drinking and the associated risk of alcohol fuel violence, and recommended that this process be started at school level with a formal education program developed to develop life skills and build resilience. It broadly supported the system of lockouts and trading controls that have been introduced in the entertainment precinct, but with a proviso be subject to a prompt review and recommendation that exemptions be offered to low-risk venues that are shown to have clean records regarding violence and misdemeanour. Mr Speaker, all of these recommendations, I believe, are quite sensible and certainly not flying in the face of the actions that government have taken in the way in which the motion is worded, asking the government to consider the recommendations. I think that that's very reasonable. That doesn't mean the government has to support all of them. And I have to say, once again, I commend the government for the steps they have taken to try and address this with those reservations about mandatory minimum sentencing. Thank you.
Questions the motion from the member for Sydney be agreed to?
Mr Temperance speak.
I call the member for Strathfield.
Thank you, Mr Temporary Speaker. I rise, I rise and am delighted to speak on the member for Sydney's motion today. I note that the Citizens Jury that has prepared this report of 25 separate recommendations, the government had the support not only of the community but of government itself, and highly commendable. I do note that working through the report, the government at the moment is trying to consider and develop its position on some of those recommendations. And from my initial assessment, very, very quickly, I think it comprises substantially good work. I think some of it is eminently practical and well considered. However, there are a number of others that need further work, simply in relation to the cost versus the benefits that are derived from it. Now, of course, I commend the work of the Citizens Jury and all of the stakeholders that participated in the process. However, I do have a fear that I would like to raise given this opportunity this afternoon. And my fear is that we are all focused, and this includes the citizens' jury, on the consequential end of the process that ends in violence. And that process invariably ends with a human in pain in a hospital, or even worse, a human not in pain and in a morgue. And my belief is that surely a substantial part of the problem has its roots in those aspects of our society that have little to do with alcohol. And my belief is that as violence is becoming a bigger problem in our community, we need to ask a number of fundamental questions. What has happened to personal accountability? What has happened to community responsibility? What has happened to the implicit and explicit authority of our parents, our teachers and our police officers? What has happened to those recreational, sporting and entertainment activities that attract the attention of our youth today? If we want to decrease violence, surely we need to look closely at how we promote personal accountability, not just through legislation, but in a cultural sense. And I believe that the citizens' jury, some of the recommendations actually deal with some of these issues. However, I think there must be an opportunity in the future to go even further than this, because I believe that while Australians pride themselves on their level of tolerance, my observations and experience are that our increasing level of tolerance has and will continue to contribute to the level of violence in our community. Today we tolerate appalling behaviour in our schools, in our public spaces and in our transport systems. We even tolerate criminal behaviour from our police officers and public servants, and we tolerate offensive behaviour directed towards police and our public servants. The courts tolerate criminal behaviour when they hand down inadequate sentences. I believe that all these fundamental issues have to be addressed if we want to truly deal with the issues of violence and the downstream consequences of that. I believe that today we tolerate the substantial time of our youth being taken up watching violent movies and playing violent games, and we ignore the effects that they have on our developing young. These are all issues that must be addressed in a wider sense, not just looking at the end of the process where we actually see violence being perpetrated in our streets and our public spaces. Mr Temporary Speaker, we spend billions of dollars on providing entertainment based on graphic but non-consequential violence. Our youth can experience the glamour, excitement and adventure of violence without experiencing its very real consequences. We tolerate this constant desensitising of our youth. We need to do something about it. It is time that in these aspects we become more intolerant. Again, Mr Temporary Speaker, I'd like to commend the work of the jury, hoping that perhaps a similar citizens' jury could deal with some of the issues, broader issues that I've raised here this afternoon, looking at perhaps the roots of some of the violence that we have in our society. I commend the member for Sydney for bringing this motion to the House.
I thank the member for Strathfield. I call the member for Macquarie Fields. Sorry, I was going to say Lake Macquarie.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. 3 years ago in this place, in response to an excellent private member statement by the then member for Sydney, Clover Moore, I said, the first thing anybody with a drinking problem has to do is to admit to it. And both the previous government and prior to this latest legislation, the current government did not admit that alcohol-related violence was not only a significant problem but an increasing one. And it's not just the violence, because as the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education said in their submission, every year we have 1,200 people die as a result of alcohol consumption, 50,000 hospitalisation, 14,000 alcohol-related non-domestic assault and 10,000 alcohol-related domestic assault. There is also considerable financial costs, $1.02 billion on alcohol abuse, about $1,565 for every household in New South Wales. So that's why in mid-November 2013, the Labor opposition released their policy, Drink Smart, Home Safe, a plan to tackle alcohol-related harm. Many of the features of that policy have also been recommended by the Citizens' Jury policy document, which is why I call on the government to look very carefully at their document, because alcohol policy is a work in progress, which is why Citizens' Jury such as this is so vital to the ongoing contribution to alcohol-led violence. The government had no option but to take the actions that they did in late January, because the current situation with uncontrolled alcohol-related violence 16 months after the death of Thomas Kelly was continuing completely unacceptable. And as the AMA submission to the New Democracy Foundation says, over recent years Sydney's nightlife has sadly become an unsafe environment due to risky and aggressive drinking behaviour. As Professor Al has said, in my line of work and the everyday activities of my colleagues, the consequences of alcohol-related harm in the form of binge drinking and violent assaults are all too familiar. As one who regularly speaks to the staff at St Vincent's, there is no doubt that the policies introduced in late January have made a dramatic effect on the amount of alcohol-related damage at St Vincent's. The 1:30 a.m. lockouts and 3 o'clock last drinks have been vital, but the Labor policy did also recommend that there be transport improvements that treated every Friday and Saturday night as a major event, and I know the member for Coogee spoke about the difficulty getting transport at 3 a.m. The Labor policy also recommended a new independent liquor regulator committing to minimising alcohol-related harm, risk-based licensing, undercover operations and tracking the cost of the alcohol to the community. This is a government that continues to accept money from alcohol. Paul Nicolau, the lobbyist, is under suspension at the moment, but he was a major driver.
Point of order, Member for Cromer.
Accepting donations from any alcohol provider is against the law. The government has not done that.
To the point of order, I was not referring to donations, I was referring to the fact that they accept advertising on buses from the alcohol lobby, and I'd like to continue along that line because this is exactly what they do.
I think you can continue along. Thank you.
This is government that accepts money from the alcohol industry by advertising alcohol on the sides of the buses for
You didn't do that in government. Are you sure about that?
We did do it in government.
Thank
it was
you.
wrong
That's
then
what that- no,
and
no.
wrong now.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you're the finance minister. You can say today, you can say we will no longer accept money from the alcohol industry to the state treasury for finances. You can do that. It's been recommended by this policy. I asked the minister to do it today.
Mr Speaker.
I thank the member for Macquarie Fields. I call the member for Murray-Darling.
Thank you, Mr Temporary Speaker. I certainly sympathise with the views of the member for Sydney and the community in the heart of Sydney, but we have had to make some reforms, and I think most members have identified the need for those reforms. There's absolutely no doubt that the precincts in the King's Cross area are an attraction, and particularly for those people that want to engage in heavy drinking. It attracted quite a few elements that I think that were detrimental to the spirit of an inner city lifestyle. The unfortunate part about reforms is there's always going to be some fallout that's going to be felt by elements in the community, and in this case it's identifying that some of those elements are certainly law-abiding people with a purpose for collecting and socialising and enjoying each other's company. I can only say that whilst I recognise that this reform will have its impacts, and the member for Sydney's already highlighted the fallout from the cross into other communities, nearby communities. They're obviously going to see an increase in patronage because they've been driven out of that traditional area. In my electorate, some of these changes, obviously, not so much that the stringent rules of the early lockout, but some of the laws relating to take away alcohol. We had to accept that reform in the country areas, and some of my country areas, the driving bottle department serves as a 7-Eleven. We don't have those convenience stores in some places, and as a consequence of that, they provided more items other than alcohol. So there has been, for me, a lot to deal with in relation to some of that. The fact is that we're all in this together. We need to reflect on where we are, how we're going to change this culture of heavy drinking. I don't think it's in the best interest of the citizens of New South Wales going forward. There's absolutely no doubt that violence was on the increase. We were seeing violent acts on a continuing basis, and these I might add, weren't really traditional. I mean, you could go to King's Cross. I did national service. I was in King's Cross in the late 60s, and you know, I mean, there was probably altercations, but nothing of this nature. I mean, there was a big attraction to the cross. It was a night spot, and as a consequence, when we're in that situation, the army, it's a collecting point, it's a meeting place, and I would say in my time there, I never witnessed an altercation of the dimension that we've seen recently in King's Cross or in recent times. So things have changed, the culture has changed. Unfortunately, the member for Sydney's felt the impact of it. I think that if we start playing at the edges, we increase the opportunity for those people that want to seek that sort of entertainment to go into those precincts that I'm sure the member for Sydney wants to protect. And I think we've got to go through this period and try and change that culture and maybe revisit it at a later date, but certainly not now.
I thank the member for Murray-Darling. I call the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Coogee, the member for Lake Macquarie, the member for Strathfield, the member for Macquarie Fields, and the member for Murray-Darling for their very considered contributions for this motion today. And I would also like again to commend the Citizens Jury and New Democracy for putting on this process, which had the support of Premier O'Farrell and Lord Mayor Clover Moore. It was indeed refreshing to read the report into a vibrant and safe Sydney, with the group clearly dedicated to find ways to reduce violence while ensuring Sydney maintains a vibrant late night economy. I congratulate all the members of the jury and look forward to the government's serious consideration of their recommendations.
I thank the member for Sydney. Question is the motion.